What a glorious day in Cruden Bay. I've just been looking at Slains Castle in the distance, across the bay itself, and close behind me, very close behind me, is the route that the Forties pipeline comes to shore, uses to come to shore. And we'll talk a little more about that later, and we'll follow it up to the pumping station south of Whinnyfold. But here we can look at the rocks, and we see where the granite rock under Slains Castle, this great lump of granite from Whinnyfold all the way up to St Fergus really, ends. And we've got the beginnings of the metamorphic rocks, other ancient rocks that the granite punched through when it was in a molten state. And both of those rocks, the granite and the metamorphics, are the last place on earth you would come looking for oil. But here we are on a beach. We're surrounded by sand, little grains of sand. And when that sand gets buried deep within the earth's crust, it becomes a wonderful reservoir for oil. And in 1959, the discovery of a giant gas field in the Netherlands at Groningen changed the face of oil exploration in this part of the world. With drilling on the east coast of England in the 1930s, showing that the same kind of rocks existed there as existed in Germany, where there were oil fields. Now we had gas in the Netherlands, and the gas field was seen to extend under the North Sea. It then became obvious that there were perhaps reservoirs of gas and oil to be found in the North Sea. But then the issue emerges as to who owns the resources in, at that time, international waters under the North Sea. That was resolved in 1964 with, in the UK, the Continental Shelf Act. That gave the state the right to the resources and the rights to issue licenses for exploration and production, and also adopted international conventions on the demarcation of boundaries between countries, and later bipartite treaties resolved the details of those boundaries. Exploration began almost immediately, and then in 1965 BP made the first gas field discovery in the UK southern North Sea. That was followed later on by giant field discoveries made by Amoco and Shell. And then the whole UK energy system started to change with the amazing project of converting millions of household and industrial appliances to use richer natural gas in place of the locally generated coal gas. And we had a national gas grid transmission system in the UK, a real energy transformation. The first oil discovery in the UK sector of the North Sea was actually made by old Scots oil company Burma in 1966, but it was way too small to be commercially developed. So the search continued, and 1969 was really the big year for oil in the North Sea. There were two wells being drilled in 1969, one in Norway and one in the UK sector. In Norway, Phillips were drilling the last well on their contract with the Norwegian government. Over 30 wells had been drilled without any discovery of commercial oil reserves, and this was their last chance. In the UK sector, Amoco was drilling east of Aberdeen, and it was drilling in the deepest water that it thought they could reasonably develop anything they found, in 300 feet of water. That was the technical limit as far as they were concerned. And actually they were looking for more gas. They started drilling in May 1969, but it was difficult drilling. And it wasn't until they'd reached 12,000 feet below the sea surface that they realized there was no gas there. But back up at 8,000 feet, there was an interval that looked like it contained oil. They tested that oil in September 1969, and that looked like it was going to be commercial quantities. In Norway, Phillips started drilling in August. They hit problems, but eventually in October they drilled through a chalk formation that contained an enormous amount of oil. They finally tested it in November 1969, and it was a massive field, and that really wakened people up to the potential of the North Sea. Amoco, ironically, was using a BP-owned rig, the Sequest. BP took the rig back on, and they were bold enough to drill further north. And in the Forties area of the North Sea, they too discovered a massive oil field in 1970. One well, however encouraging though, is not enough to commit to millions of dollars of expense in developing a field. In fact, the Forties project required the arrangement of a financial facility to borrow up to $400 million, the largest loan ever arranged to that date, in order to get 4 massive platforms in place in water depths in excess of 300 feet, and also to lay a pipeline to shore. And pipelines, you're talking round numbers of $1 million a mile, that kind of order of magnitude of expense. So further wells were needed to delineate the field and confirm the full extent of their discovery. So the discovery, the full extent of it, wasn't announced until December 1971. By that time, the design work had been done and they figured out what they wanted to do. And they wanted to bring the oil to shore through a pipeline. And that pipeline was going to come in to Cruden Bay and follows the line of those rocks over there, coming in slightly from the north, in, and then we'll see later on through the dunes and up the escarpment towards Whinnyfold, beyond to the pumping station location. We've been talking about oil arriving in Cruden Bay, and largely we've been talking about the facts, you know, the timeline, how things happen, some of the geology behind it, stuff like that. But when you involve human beings in a business, in any endeavour, there's a lot more going on, and there's some fun to be had too. My first experience of the oil industry was in Great Yarmouth, where I joined Amoco as a petroleum engineer in 1976. And right from the word go, I got a sense of the connection with the sea and with history, because on the train from Norwich to Yarmouth, I started talking with an old lady from the northeast of Scotland. And she had been one of the girls that followed the herring fleets south on their journey down the east coast of England, and had made friends in Yarmouth back in the, well, I don't know, probably the 30s. And she was going back to visit them. And the stories are there. All the fishermen know about these stories. The thousands of girls that were involved in following the fleets, the boats that came down and would pull into different ports to gut and salt the fish. And in Yarmouth, it was local knowledge that the Scottish fishermen would not be fishing on the Sabbath. So the River Yare was filled with Scottish fishing boats, and literally you could walk from one side of the river to the other by just stepping across the Scottish herring fishing boats. So that's where the sea comes into the story of into our story. The whalers from Peterhead, when the whaling came to an end, the herring fishing was picking up, and then when the herring fishing was going down in the 60s, the oil industry was picking up. So a good little timeline of connection with the sea there. The next thing was working with Amoco. I worked with some of the people who were involved in the early discoveries. I wasn't personally involved because obviously it was a number of years after the early discoveries. But I talked, for instance, with Ernie Lirondelle, who was the company rep on the Seaquest when they made what they referred to then as the Montrose field discovery. Later on, technical issue, the discovery well was actually found to be in a field that was subsequently renamed Arbroath, and they developed an extension, a separate accumulation which took on the original name of Montrose. But anyway, they were looking for gas, I mentioned. Well, the thing was, when they found oil, they didn't actually have a sample container, an appropriate sample container to capture a sample of the oil. It was unexpected. And so they actually had to run down to the galley, and somebody brought out a pickle jar. And so the first sample of North Sea oil from the discovery well came to town in a pickle jar. The best bit though was when it got back to the operating base, which was then Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth was the base where Amoco operated its exploration program from. And in celebration, the oil was poured into an ashtray. Some of you will remember those times when people smoked, but it was poured into an ashtray on a desk in the Great Yarmouth office. And then with typical bravado, somebody struck a match and set light to the oil just to demonstrate it really was oil. And I've seen the burn marks on the desk. So there's a lot of human story behind all these facts and figures. And then a little anecdote that will amuse some people relates to the whole idea of who was first. You know, in human endeavours, there are a few bright lights that shine briefly as individuals, but actually it's teamwork and collaboration and contributions from many, many people that make our endeavours a success. So we're abbreviating a lot of the story in terms of the fact that there were many firsts in the North Sea, and not just one individual company or one individual person who made the big breakthrough. And the Burma oil find is a classic. Burma, who were the company that actually gave birth to Anglo-Persian, that was to become BP, when they made their discovery in the southern North Sea, it was too small, but the news leaked out. There was a leak of information, and the Evening Standard in London published a great spread on the discovery of North Sea oil, and it was all premature because of that leak. But the reason why the Evening Standard was so keen on publicising the discovery was that Britain was entering into one of its frequent periods of economic distress, which the oil industry has to a large extent rescued it from. But back in 1966, you know, apart from some silly little football tournament that was going on, you might remember the Kinks and one of their big hits, Sunny Afternoon. Well, if you listen to that carefully, they will refer to this squeeze that's going on, the financial squeeze. So that's your reference point for 1966 and the importance of North Sea oil bringing some needed tax receipts to the UK Treasury. We're standing here on the 13th tee of the Cruden Bay Golf Course, a magnificent golf course. And it's right here, back in 1973, that all the action was taking place. There were winches set up nearby, and they were pulling in pipe that was being laid by a pipe lay vessel moored in the bay. And there was a trench dug through the dunes, and there was piling on either side of the trench to stop the dunes collapsing. And there was another pipe lay barge out at sea, 150 miles out there, at the Forties Charlie platform location, starting to lay another section of the pipeline. And later on, the two sections would meet up at sea and be welded together for the Forties offshore pipeline. Now the question arises, why Cruden Bay? Forties field actually lies a little bit further north of Cruden Bay, but Professor William Ritchie of Aberdeen University documented the construction of the pipeline through the dunes and the subsequent remediation work so that the natural environment was not in any way damaged by these operations. And he said this was actually the best place on the East Coast to bring in a pipeline. This is a magnificent amenity, the beach and the golf course, but there's not actually anything of real serious ecological interest that could be damaged or disturbed coming ashore here. Furthermore, you've got this bay, and it's gently sloping, sediment filled, and just the perfect place to be burying a pipeline. And on top of that, the barge, which was fabricating the pipe from individual joints, welding joints together and laying them, that pipe that was being winched in ashore from the barge was protected by the bay, because pipe laying activity, particularly in shallow water, is very weather dependent. So this was the perfect place. Once the shore section had been winched in, then the barge itself could start moving out towards the Forties location, gradually laying the pipe down into the trench that had previously been dug on the seabed by other barges ahead of it. And it's buried because you don't want fishermen and their nets fouling the line, pulling up the pipe, perhaps even sinking their boats. So that line was buried. There's more, of course, to the Forties pipeline system than simply the offshore line that runs from the field to the beach here. That's a 130-mile long subsea pipeline. But there's also a land section of that line, an onshore section that runs from here up the escarpment and on down to the pumping station, and then at Cruden Bay and at a couple of other stations along the road, it's kept on moving 105 miles down to Kinneil, adjacent to the Grangemouth refinery.